Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Oona Hathaway, who is the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law at the Yale Law School. Her current research focuses on the foundations of modern international law, the intersection of U.S. constitutional law and international law, the enforcement of international law, and the law of armed conflict. Professor Hathaway has published more than 25 law review articles. Today we'll talk with her about the new book she co-authored with Yale Law professor Scott Shapiro titled The Internationalists: How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War Remade the World. Welcome, Professor Hathaway.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Well, the book argues that the world used to look very different than it looks today, that war was perfectly legal and legitimate, that states could use it to right any kind of wrong. And as a result, conquest was legal, gunboat diplomacy was legal. You couldn't be tried for the crime of aggression because there wasn't any such thing. And the world that this produced was very brutal and bloody and a pretty terrible place to live. That conquest was so common that the average state could expect to suffer conquest roughly once in an ordinary human lifetime. And we argue that all changed. And it changed as a result of a much maligned international agreement, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which outlawed war. And that was the beginning of the unraveling of this old system.
Okay, and you talk about the old way or the old world order. Tell us a little bit more about that specifically and how it's changed to today.
Yeah, so the old world order was a world where if a state had any kind of a grievance with another state, they would first try to resolve it diplomatically, but if that wasn't successful, they could go to war over it. So we found all these old war manifestos that states had issued against one another saying, here's why we're going to war. And they would say things like, you interfered with our trade relations, so we're going to war. Or they would say things like, you are failing to repay debts, and so we're going to war over that. Or you're getting too powerful and we're afraid you're eventually going to invade us, so we're going to war. There was even a manifesto for the U.S. invading Mexico. So in the Spanish-American War, Mexican-American War, the United States went to war against Mexico because Mexico failed to repay nearly $2 million in debts. Many people think of that war as having been caused by skirmishes on the border, and that was a contributing factor. But really the legal reason for going to war was because Mexico had agreed to repay a series of debts and then defaulted on the debt repayments. And the U.S. went to war to claim territory. Much of what's now California and New Mexico, much of southwestern United States is now part of the United States because we went to war to reclaim that territory as repayment for the debt.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more of the act that changed to bring about this new world order.
Yeah, so as I said, war was perfectly legal and legitimate for hundreds of years. World War I was an old world order war. States went to war against one another over a variety of grievances, some of them bigger than others, some of them more petty. And at the end of the war, which was brutal and bloody and millions of people had died, there was a widespread effort to try and find a way to end the war. And there was a man, his name is Salmon Levinson, who was a bankruptcy lawyer in Chicago, who we'd never heard of before, but we realized he was a guy who came up with this idea of outlawing war. He thought war was terribly destructive, it was a waste, and that if the countries of the world could get together and agree to outlaw war, then things might change. And he created an organization, the Foundation for the Outlawry of War. He worked together with politicians and peace activists to get this idea kind of broadly circulated. And eventually that led to a treaty in 1928 where nearly every country in the world gathered together in Paris to outlaw war. And they agreed to renounce war as a tool of state policy. Within a year, nearly every nation in the world had renounced the right to go to war and had given up this tool that they had used for hundreds of years to right wrongs. Now, the problem was that they hadn't really thought about what comes next. So they hadn't really thought through, how do we then take this promise and make it a reality? How do we take this idea of outlawing war and find other ways to achieve the same purposes that war used to serve? You know, if a state fails to repay a debt, how are we going to collect on that debt? If someone interferes with our trade relations, how are we going to address that? If a state breaks the rules and conquers territory, what are we going to do about it? They hadn't really thought that through, but they had taken the really important first step of outlawing war.
Okay, and what was the next step?
So the next step was trying to figure out, okay, if war is no longer legal, what are we going to do instead? And so in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and the world had to figure out, how are we going to enforce this pact? We've just renounced the right to go to war. Can we go to war to enforce the prohibition on war? How are we going to enforce this rule? And Henry Stimson, who had been a classmate of Salmon Levinson's here at Yale, he had been corresponding with Salmon Levinson, and Levinson had said, well, one way to enforce the rule is just simply to refuse to recognize that the territory that a state has seized is theirs. And so for hundreds of years, whenever a state took territory, as the United States took much of the what is now the southwestern United States, everyone assumed, okay, it's now yours. There wasn't any kind of disagreement about the legal rights of the territory, even if the war was waged for illegitimate reasons. And the big step that Stimson made, and what became known as the Stimson Doctrine, was to say, you might take the territory, but it's not yours. We are not going to recognize this as being Japanese territory. We're going to refuse to recognize any treaties or agreements that are brought about as a result of this invasion. And that was really the first time in human history something like that had happened, that they refused to recognize the conquest. They refused to recognize agreements brought about through gunboat diplomacy. And that had a real impact in changing the value of taking territory, because if you took it, you couldn't now sell the goods, you couldn't issue passports, marriages aren't recognized, all the things that you get out of having the territory as being part of yours, you no longer got. And that was the first step. They then had to figure out all the rest of the pieces. How are they going to manage without gunboat diplomacy, which had been used for hundreds of years? How are they going to enforce the rule against aggression? Is there going to be a crime of aggression? Ultimately, they decided yes, and that's resulted in the Nuremberg trials after World War II. So each of these pieces, they had to begin to put into place. And part of the story we tell, the Internationalists that the book is named for, are the people who are trying to figure that out. They're struggling with, how do we take this idea that war is not going to be the way we're going to resolve our disputes anymore, and how are we going to create a new system with a set of rules that are going to be effective, and what are those going to look like?
Okay, and let's talk about the Internationalists. I believe there's 4 that you highlight in your book?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a whole cast of characters in the book. There are 4 key characters. Okay. One of them is Salmon Levinson, who I mentioned. He has a colleague, James T. Shotwell, who is something of a frenemy, we'd say today. They got along, but they didn't always agree about what the outlawry movement should look like and how it should achieve its goals. Shotwell took the idea of outlawing war, and he's part of the reason that Aristide Briand, the French foreign minister, got interested in the idea and proposed, in fact, the idea back to the United States. And so he was the one who helped make the agreement come to fruition, even though Levinson didn't really appreciate his meddling, nor did Frank Kellogg, the U.S. Secretary of State, who was actually incredibly upset that Briand had made the proposal. And although Kellogg later won the Nobel Peace Prize for it, he initially was completely opposed to it. So there are a whole cast of really interesting characters, some of them more appealing, some of them really unappealing. Levinson's one of my favorite. Another is Hirsch Lauterpacht, who was one of the key figures thinking through all the ways in which the rules were going to become effective. He wrote the opening statements at Nuremberg. He was the person who really helped figure out how to put all the different pieces together, including the crime of aggression and holding the Nazis liable for waging an illegal war. Nearly his entire family had been killed in the Holocaust. And so he was there for the initial opening argument, but he just couldn't sit through the trial. It was so incredibly painful for him. And so, I mean, all these people are incredibly interesting. And what's fascinating about it for me is that they're real people struggling with ideas. They don't really know exactly what to do, and they're trying to figure it out, and they're arguing with one another, and they've got kind of envy, and they've got their own personal interests in it. And it's so interesting to see how, they become real. They're real people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they are the ones who are responsible for giving us the legal order that we have, but they're just like us in that they have the same kinds of desires and jealousies, but they're really deeply committed to an idea, which is creating a world where war is no longer going to be the main way in which states resolve their disputes with one another, and they're devoted to trying to figure out how to make that work.
Okay, and what about the UN? What role does the UN play in your story?
So many people think all this starts with the UN. So they think, okay, yeah, I see that the modern legal order is different from the way the old one was, but really that's because of the United Nations. And the United Nations is really important, but what's key to understand is that the UN is not just kind of inventing things out of whole cloth. It's not coming up with the idea for the first time. The central ideas in the United Nations Charter first appear in the 1928 Kelly-Briand Pact, and all this effort of working out what the rules are going to look like is what makes the United Nations Charter possible. And in fact, we found that James T. Shotwell, who I mentioned, was the one who kind of worked on Outlawing War and who was kind of in competition / agreed with Salmon Levinson. He, in fact, was a member of a group formed within the State Department by another one of our internationalists, Sumner Wells, who was an Undersecretary of State in the State Department. He convened a group, including James T. Shotwell, to think through, okay, now that war's broken out again, how are we going to keep the peace after this war? And they come up with a first draft of the United Nations. And in fact, we found a document in the Roosevelt Library with the initials JTS, James Thomas Shotwell, which we believe is the very first draft of what would become the United Nations Charter. And in that draft, he actually cut and pasted the pact's text directly at the very beginning. Then eventually that turns into the Article 2.4, the prohibition on use of force in the modern charter. But you can really see how the ideas of the charter are coming not just indirectly, but directly out of the pact. And they're building all these institutions around it to try and make it effective.
Okay, and looking at the pact today, does it still resonate with what is going on in the world today? I mean, do you think it will survive?
Well, this is a real challenge. At this moment, we see this world order once again up for grabs. And I think what the book helps us see is the way that things are is relatively new. The idea that war isn't a legal and legitimate means of resolving disputes is relatively new. And there's no reason that it can't change again. And part of this is meant to be a warning, to say, look, the world used to look very different. It was much worse. For all the foibles and problems with the modern legal order, and we're very honest about all of those, it's not perfect, but it's so much better than what came before. And be very careful what you put at risk. The threats to withdraw from the World Trade Organization, for instance, the pulling back of support for the United Nations, the kind of threats to use military force in ways that wouldn't be consistent with the United Nations Charter. These are very dangerous things to be doing because they put this achievement of the internationalists very much at risk. And what we're trying to tell people in the book is see what the internationalists achieve, see how important that transformation was, see how difficult it was, and be careful before you put that all at risk.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your work.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
For more information about Professor Hathaway and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.